So now we're going to talk about types of sampling, how we can collect them, and what is bias. So bias is when we get a sample that produces results. So we're going to get results. But there's a problem. They systematically differ from the population. Now, what do you mean systematically? That means if I were to redo it again, it would probably be different, much different than what the population is telling us. So it doesn't represent the population very well. So it's going to do it time and time again. It's systematically going to be different. Now, again, if we think about doing it correctly and I get a sample, it still is going to be different than the population, but not every single time I do it. And so this is something we really want to avoid. So some different ways that produce a sample that is going to be biased is convenience. And it's just like that, like it says, convenience. It's readily available. So let's suppose I'm wondering about study time at SKC, or any college for that matter, and I want to know how long freshmen take to study, and I go to the library. So I'm only getting people that are probably studying because most people just study at the library. I'm not checking out dorm rooms or where other students are hanging out. So that would be a convenient sample. I just go to the library and get it, and that's going to be bias. It might be if I'm looking at a product. Let's suppose I'm doing something with potato chips. What happens to the heavy potato chips? They end up at the bottom of the bag. So what if I just take the chip off the top? Probably is not going to represent the population of all chips. The lighter ones typically stay on top. So we want to think about how we're collecting this. Where are we going? How are we going about doing it? That's why it's so important in Chapter 2 to do this sampling. And you'll find through your big idea and your homework that it takes a little bit of time and some work to think about it. Voluntary, well, that's just exactly what it says. Subjects, because we're talking about people, they choose to be in the sample. Now this is going to be bias. So for example, back in the day, several years ago, during a football game, a pro football game, NFL, the referee made a call. They would have a call-in number. They would have a 1-800 number that you could call in and tell them what your opinion is. So again, who's going to call? Somebody that has a strong opinion. So you can't really use a volunteer sample because it doesn't represent everyone. So anybody that has a strong opinion is going to take the time to call in. Just like if you're going to vote something on TV, you're going to call in if you have an opinion. We're going to miss all the people that really don't care, but could see the call and maybe have a non-biased look at what was done. So these are ways of sampling. So types of bias that happen through these sampling methods. Selection. So selection either excludes or includes certain people. Okay? And that might be through, again, a telephone survey or maybe just a survey. So why would a telephone survey work this way? Well, I would only be able to call people that have a telephone. I can't get those people that maybe have non-landlines anymore. So you can see it's going to exclude certain people or include certain people. So we want to make sure we avoid that. And we have under selection bias a type called undercoverage. And this is where people are just not accessible. So this happens a lot with the telephone, just like with a phone. Okay, maybe now because we have a cell phone, maybe the numbers are unlisted and we can't access those people. So people are not accessible. So those are types of names of biases under these types of sampling methods that we want to avoid. Non-response, just like it says, people do not respond. I've done this before. Maybe you have too. You get a phone call from maybe the CDC on what kind of immunizations have you done for your children, and I would just hang up. Well, they would call again, and they would call again, and they're pretty persistent depending on what they are trying to get a sample for. But oftentimes, a non-response is either somebody doesn't respond or you cannot be reached. Okay, this mainly happens when we do surveys. Okay, you just choose not to answer those questions. Response is, yeah, you respond, but the subject, the person being asked, they're going to answer differently. They're not truthful. And I'd have to say, maybe I've done this a time or two, when they ask your income, okay, maybe you pad that, or maybe you don't report your income as accurately as maybe you should. So you're responding differently depending on if there's an outcome that you are looking for. Maybe you were asked a personal question about drug use. Maybe you respond differently. So these are types of bias. Again, you don't need to memorize these words, but if you think about it, non-response, oh, maybe that person just doesn't respond. You'll always have access to this. And so what we need to do is make sure that we look about how the sample was obtained or collected. That's something that you need to look at when you first start to read a study. Like, could this thing be biased? Where did these people come from? How were the questions asked? Where were they asked? How was the number or the subjects in my sample determined? So that's the second lecture for chapter 2.